we're going to get the ball rolling here. So the point of this Share the Wealth is to go over the discovery and service mapping ITOM Bootcamp that I attended 3-4 weeks ago. And also to talk about the ACC, which is the Agent Client Collector, which is the discovery agent that it kind of gives you an alternative in scenarios where, client doesn't want to provide credentials. Now there is an agent that you can deploy. Okay, so without further ado, the agenda for today is to, like I said, just cover the ITOM Bootcamp activities that I did and some of the information that I gathered. So that's going to cover best practices from both discovery and service mapping, and cover some of the 4 population methods for service mapping, and talk about the machine learning connections as well a tiny bit. And going to wrap up the presentation with the Agent Client Collector and a quick demo on that. So Colin is going to take care of the ACC at the end. Okay, so let's dive right into it. Okay, so talking about discovery best practices. So here we have like a quick guide on some of the implementation guidance for discovery. So it's always important to continue to sell value even outside the sales cycle. So that's kind of something to keep in the back of your head there. Teach admins instead of kind of doing the work for them. So kind of teach the person how to fish instead of giving them the fish. And of course, there's definitely limitations there too. Always get executive sponsorship. So nothing moves mountain more than a CEO saying, get it done. So that's kind of an important aspect. Sometimes you don't have control on that. Like you don't have executive sponsorship, or you don't have somebody high up from the executive side to kind of drive some of these asks. So that depends on the project. Another important point is that ensure your discovery admins, your customer discovery admins, have gone through training. This is a big issue that can arise, and I've had this happen in projects where we roll the discovery, we get on the project, we discuss requirements and all that, and then the customer doesn't really know how to use the platform, and you're spending a lot of time explaining things, which is understandable, but like there is a limit to that too when you have other tasks to do, and then now you're kind of not wasting time, but you're kind of deviating from your tasks to kind of make sure that the customer understands what you're doing and is kind of feeling comfortable about that. And again, always continue to sell value even outside the sales cycle, just repeating the same thing. So the point here is like, it's not just a computer record from this discovery perspective. It has relationship, it has some value to the business. So that's kind of the point that it's trying to emphasize here. Okay, some of the implementation gotchas. Again, everything I'm talking so far is from the discovery perspective. We're gonna talk about service mapping a bit later in the presentation. So number 1 implementation gotcha is credentials. Number 2, same thing, credentials. Network restrictions is also a big one, depending on what kind of environments you're scanning, and firewall rules and network restrictions, things like that. Also important to take note and to kind of bring it up at the beginning. Technology silos, departments are not talking about, or like certain teams are not sharing that information. Everybody's siloed on their own. Another one that's good to be aware of it, there's not much you can do, is like the customer has another tool, maybe they're upgrading or they're transitioning from an old tool to ServiceNow, and they're just scared of change. But again, you just got to drive the point to get training, and I guess emphasize the workshop, like have more details in the workshops to kind of drive those points home. And of course, credentials again. Any questions so far?
Hey, Vlad, do you ever see any issues with credentials?
No, I never heard of that one, actually. I should put it in the slide.
I can't do dad jokes this early in the morning, man. Keep going.
Okay, a bit of information about credentials here, nothing new. I guess the only important thing here to note is this pro tip. So if service mapping is part of the scope of that project, it just makes sense to get those credentials up front when you're getting the discovery credentials. Just bundle all discovery and service mapping together and have one activity instead of 2, and waiting on the service mapping credentials to be deployed later. So a lot of these best practices are very common sense, more than others. And like the whole point of this presentation is kind of to refresh some of these, and for the people that do not have some of this knowledge to share that knowledge. So some remedies for credentials. In the case that the Windows team does not want to provide you the correct level of service account for Windows, there is a remedy which is just enough admin. It's kind of like sudo for Windows, where you can kind of target commands and give privileges to specific commands. So that's an option. Myself, I've never used it, but it is out there. Another remedy would be utilize a third-party credential store like CyberArk, so storing the credentials on the customer side or in this other third-party tool. That way, we're not touching credentials. Credentials are not stored in the ServiceNow instance. And then another point here is that guaranteed there should be some user local admin that is used somewhere in the environment, or it's not guaranteed, but it's very likely, right? And the last point here is non-interactive user is not required. From a network perspective, some of the remedies that you can accommodate is you can place the mid-server, from a placement perspective, you can place the mid-servers where the least restriction is. So that way, maybe you can bypass some firewall rules. Again, that depends on the customer. So you can suggest this, but the customer may say, no, we can't do that, or we don't want to deploy additional mid-servers for that region. It's just good to have in your pocket there, in your back pocket. Another point here for network remedies for WMI queries. So you can use WinRM discovery. That way you can just use the secure HTTP based ports instead of the WMI ports. And the last point here regarding network remedies is related to proxies. So you can, again, depends on the scenario and if the customer has the requirement for a proxy. So a proxy would essentially sit between the mid server and the ServiceNow instance. So let's say they don't want you to even allow that 443 outbound connection to the instance. You can use a proxy and kind of divert the traffic through that proxy. Again, it's not a common scenario, but it's good to know that there's a remediation to that problem. So from a base configuration perspective, there are some things that just to keep in mind. A discovery schedule should be named based on their geography. That kind of helps with troubleshooting. The use of range sets instead of called IP ranges. So this is like the newer format of deploying IP ranges. Is just a different way of putting it. It's more organized. You can kind of group it a bit better, and it's easily integrated with IPAM solutions as well. Use trusted protocol name sources and a few other settings here, like disable the IP probe cache, enable IP service affinity, and modify the port probe classification priority. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, talking from a cloud discovery perspective, it's encouraged to use read-only policies and roles whenever possible. Avoid using the all capability. This is a very common thing you kind of like forget about, or like, oh, I'll just configure it later, but it just makes sense to do it from the get-go. So this could have some impact on your AWS discovery. Also depends if you're using this instance profile name, which is another way to discover AWS without using credentials. Another important aspect to think about is to upgrade from probes to patterns, as again, specifically for cloud discovery. Use the cross-assume role functionality as well for multiple AWS accounts. For large discovery implementation, it makes sense to use AWS config and Azure alerts and Google Stack drivers. So essentially what these things do, you won't have to run discovery as often because for example, AWS config just updates the CMDB in real time or close to real time instead of waiting for that discovery schedule to. Also, another point here that I didn't really know about is for large discovery implementation, it makes sense to monitor the hardware table because apparently in older releases, there have been some known issues to where this table gets just explodes and you're getting like millions of records in it. Here we have a mid-server estimator. So during the bootcamp, they had an Excel file, but I never got a copy of that Excel file where you kind of just put in the number of computers or you just input the numbers and it has like some calculation, a macro or something, and it just spews out the time. So for this example, let's say we have 1,000 computers we want to discover. And like how long would that take with just one mid server and just 25 threads? So on average, it's going to take you about 4 hours to discover those things. Any questions about this so far? Okay, so let's talk about extending the out-of-the-box capabilities. So some good tips to think about is ensure you're using patterns for discovery instead of probes. It's kind of redundant now because all the new releases are using patterns, but I guess in an environment where customer has had ServiceNow for quite some time, maybe they never did upgrade to the patterns, and they're still using the probes and sensors. Another benefit with using the patterns, you can get the latest dated plugin that has the latest and greatest patterns. So you're, instead of updating it one by one or looking to see if there's new features for that pattern, you're just updating the Discovery Patterns plugin, which updates all the patterns that ServiceNow took care of or updated or fixed. Another important point is to use extension section within the patterns instead of using the out-of-the-box identification or connection sections. The point here is that if you use extension sections, the pattern is not tagged as modified, and you will still be able to update the pattern. Whenever you update the plugin, the pattern will update. So the issue here is that whenever you modify an out-of-the-box pattern, that pattern is tagged as modified. So whenever that pattern is updated, you will not get those updates. Duplicate the out-of-the-box patterns when needed to make sure to make them your own. So instead of modifying it, just duplicate it and adjust the steps. And the last point here for extending capabilities is know the power of pre and post processing scripts. Okay, so another kind of high value points here for extending capabilities is to start talking about the agent client collector for help and visibility. So it's good to make the customer aware that there are other options for alternatives to credential discovery. There's the alternative using the agent, which would not require credentials. Also know the credentialless discovery capabilities and pitfalls like Nmap installation, dependent on third-party signatures and impacts to CMDB records. And another kind of like a good point here for the consultants is to get comfortable with the identification and reconciliation process in all their locations. And by all their locations is not just geographic, but think of data sources, like where is that data coming from? Okay, so let's say everything went smoothly, discovery was implemented, customer's happy, go live is done. Now you're gonna roll off the project and the project was successful. But the work is not done because on the client side, at least a discovery admin has some activities to kind of just keep the lights on, just feeding and caring of the CMDB, like, looking at the discovery schedule, investigating any errors and seeing if those errors relate to what those errors relate to, being an active participant in the CMDB working groups, and having some participation in the ServiceNow community. So this is kind of a lot of clients, and I've had this happen where the customer just thinks that, you set it and forget it. Once we're done the implementation, discovery just does its own thing and nobody needs to take a look at it, but that is not the case. Okay, so now from a service mapping perspective, the bullet points are very similar to the discovery side. It just has some smaller tweaks. So again, always continue to sell value, even outside that sales cycle. It's not just a computer record. It has relationship. It has responsibility to the business. It has value. Always get this executive sponsorship. Again, making sure customer has gone through discovery and service mapping training, at least discovery. Again, teach the admins, don't do the work, but teach them, demonstrate the work. And service mapping is a team effort. So you're going to have access to, application SMEs, infrastructure architects, network engineers, server teams, things like that. Okay, a few more bullet points here for the overall ITOM success. Again, executive sponsorship, very important. It influences across, it has influence across the organization. It helps remove roadblocks. Realistic targets. So again, depends on the, on the task and the ask from the customer. But know what to tackle early, think of the easier tasks first and then tackle the harder tasks later. And again, start with out of the box pattern and know what is supported. And maybe, there's other approaches that you can take for service mapping. Let's say you can do manual mapping or you can do tag-based. There's other quicker options to show value instead of the complex top-down approach. Another prerequisite is credentials should be ready to go, and CMDB must be able to support that desired functionality. Following best practices, and again, organizational collaboration. We need access to those SMEs. We need access to those teams that we're gonna need information from them. We're gonna need, let's say, firewall rules passed, or we're gonna need some other access to the devices or the infrastructure we are discovering. Any questions so far?
I had a question on the agent-based approach. What are the limitations or differences between agent-based and agentless?
So the agent-based, again, does not require credentials. The other one does require credential. Wait, sorry, you're referring to credential-less and agent, not...
No. Agentless and agent-based discovery. So what are the differences between limitations on those?
Gotcha.
Specifically using the agent.
Right. So agent does not give you, it is not using discovery patterns. So you will not be able to discover applications, for example.
Well, and this is something we're going to go through in the demo once Vlad gets done.
Right. So we will talk about the ACC a bit later in the presentation.
How much did they emphasize on, you just mentioned CMDB being ready. How much did they emphasize CMDB being ready via CSDM?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So yeah, that's something that you need to kind of look at the data that they have. And if it's a new customer, then you kind of get away with it because assuming there's no data in there, you don't have to set up or clean or review anything. But in the case that customer has put data in there, you would have to make sure that that data aligns to the CSDM. And if it does not, that's something that needs to be addressed right away, because that's gonna take hours to fix, and potentially it's gonna be a roadblock on the mapping side. Any other questions? So let's dive into the population methods. So this again refers specifically to service mapping. So there's 4 methods to create a service map, and it's important to remember that all these 4 options are in your toolbox. It's not necessarily that you're going to use one or the other. You can use a combination of all of them, or you can, like I was saying earlier, you can show some quick value by creating a manual map or a dynamic CI group, or even tag based. Okay, so now I'm just going to cover each of those categories and kind of describe what are the benefits or where should these be used. So the dynamic CI group is well suited for mapping CIs to services that require no components or topological relationships. So let's say you just want to, map all your Linux servers in a specific data center, or all your Windows server, or your, let's say, Windows Server 2012 for a specific attribute as well. You can create a group and identify all of those. You're manually selecting the CIs. You can use queries as well, again, using attributes or relationships, but there is no visual map and there's no impact tree. You're just relating infrastructure CIs to a service, and that's it. There's no topological structure. Okay, moving on to the manual map. So this one is, you can manually relate the CIs to the service to kind of quickly visualize application components and topology. So you can build a topology here. Again, it depends on the information that you have. So you can kind of create some relationship between the manual CIs. Okay. Any CI class can be visualized on the map and introduces user-defined topology, as I mentioned. So this would be different compared to the dynamic CI group, where you're just getting a list of CIs, no hierarchy. Manual, you can set up some hierarchy. Again, it's not recommended because you're going to have manual intervention. As soon as that map is saved, that it could potentially be out of date. Infrastructure could change. That server maybe they added a new server, took out a server. Not recommended, but it does have some value in certain scenarios. Moving on to tag-based. So mapping CIs to simple service membership that requires no or limited relationships. So this also requires the cloud to be discovered and tags to be discovered as well, part of that cloud discovery. So the way tag-based works is that as you're getting all those tags from discovery, you can categorize them and make sure that you kind of have some alignment between the tags, because sometimes you can have, let's say you have app name, that's a tag, and then you have application name. They both mean the same thing, but you have 2 tags with different values. So category, you kind of group that. Oh, sorry, that's within the family where you can group multiple categories. Removing tag categories should not be done without careful consideration. So this is a kind of an automatic process where you set up the category, you set up the family, and then it generates the maps. And then from that generated or suggested maps list, you select the ones that you want. You could do all of them, or you can just pick the ones that you want, or the client ones. Okay, and last one, top-down discovery. So this is the complete service mapping discovery that discovers all the relationships and components using the discovery patterns. You can also get recommended connections based on the traffic that's based on Netstat and the application dependency probe. There's also a new feature called machine learning connections. So it's kind of the new traffic-based way. Traffic-based is still available, but machine learning is using traffic and the ADM probe to better target the connections. Instead of traffic-based gives you click a CI, it gives you all the connections. With machine learning connection suggestions, you get those as well, but you get also suggestions based on the application fingerprinting. It requires credentials, it requires pseudo privileges for accessing configuration files and data, requires operational horizontal discovery, IP ranges. If you do have load balancer discovery in place, you can bulk map with candidates identified based on the load balancer services. And so talking about application fingerprinting, so this is kind of a new feature, and I think they brought it in Paris. So it kind of suggests for generic applications, it suggests and potentially creates your discovery pattern and discovery identifier without you doing too much. You're just looking at the suggestions. You're like, hey, yes, this java.exe with these certain attributes. Yeah, that's part of my application. So you bring it from suggested to implemented, and pretty much out of the box, it's not out of the box, but process creates the pattern and the identifiers. And as I was saying earlier, with the ML-based connections, you're not just getting the traffic-based seen by Netstat. Any questions so far? Okay, and now let's just dive a bit into the ML connection suggestions. So on the left side here, you have the application fingerprints dashboard. So like I was saying, it suggests certain application server is still a part of the application class. So don't think of server, think of application here. It's just like a subclass of application. So it gives you all suggested applications and more specific for application server as well. And you can kind of see here a breakdown of the suggested processes, suggested applications. So together with this application fingerprinting and the Netstat traffic-based discovery and the ADM probe, which gives you the dependency mapping, you can get a picture of something like this, where this is a service map. You have, your connection suggestions appear up here. It's not, I think you can still right click and get the options, but you also get a button at the top. Once everything is in place, the machine learning is enabled, application fingerprint is enabled, and you have some applications identified there, you would right click or click on connection suggestion and you get this window here. And you can see that this one here that's highlighted has AFP, and AFP is a application that was discovered based on application fingerprint. And you get the other Netstat and other connection suggestions as well. But this one is specifically identified based on the application fingerprint. Any questions? It kind of wraps up my ITOM Bootcamp. We're going to switch to the ACC. So any questions related to the slides covered so far? All righty. Okay, Colin, I think it's your go.
Okay, thanks, Vlad. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the agent client collector. So this is sort of the alternative to the agent list discovery that's typically done. So just to explain the difference. So the agent list discovery works by installing a mid server, which is a Java application on a VM in the customer's network. And the mid server reaches out to the discovery target devices using standard ports and protocols like WMI, SSH, SNMP. It remotely logs into the machine with credentials like username and password, gathers the info, and then sends it back to the ServiceNow instance. Now, this method can cause a lot of security concerns for customers. I'm currently starting an implementation right now where it's exactly that. It's a pretty big security concern. They get concerned about, well, why are you putting, this server in our network? What is it doing? Why do we have to give you these credentials? And these can be tough battles to fight sometimes. So the agent client collector gives us an alternative to that. It allows us to actually install an application on the targets that we need to be discovering. And then the agent lives on that machine. It's always running, constantly doing checks, gathering data, sending that data back to ServiceNow. So, it's same end result. And, at the end of the day, the records get back into ServiceNow. This is just a different method of gathering that data and sending it back to the instance. So just to give a brief overview of, where things are today with the agent and the roadmap ServiceNow has. So essentially right now, the agent supports ITOM, the ITOM applications in ServiceNow. So that's ITOM Visibility and ITOM Health, which is, classically, we know them as discovery and event management and operational intelligence. But it's an in-house solution to consolidate the legacy monitoring tools. A lot of, legacy monitoring tools also use similar types of agents to send data back to their, servers that are monitoring their systems. It's also an ease of implementation for ITOM health and service mapping. So kind of like I was saying before, if you're having trouble, with getting credentials or just even being able to set up a mid server that's going to remotely reach out to systems, you can now offer the agent as a solution where these kinds of concerns are going to be coming up. And it's also leveraging the machine learning. So that's, what we would have previously seen with operational intelligence, the same type of idea where events and metrics are being collected. ServiceNow is trying to, create baselines and predict problems are going to occur. And yeah, that goes down to the next point for service and availability monitoring, synthetic monitoring. So you can essentially run like synthetic transactions and get the performance monitoring data back into ServiceNow. So that's kind of where things are today. Looking forward into the future, the agent is going to help with supporting ITSM and ITAM by just enriching incident information that the agent has been to collect. There's going to be integration hub spokes for automatic remediation on the agent targets. And it's also going to allow collecting data for post-change implementation verification. So, once a change is expected to be implemented, the agent can verify that that change actually went through. It's also going to help support SecOps by allowing ad hoc queries and real-time investigation. Since you have an agent living on a remote host, it makes it very easy to, just get immediate performance information and help with investigation. It's also going to help with detecting malicious processes running on endpoint servers, which I think would be very, big value add for security teams. And it's also going to help remediate the vulnerabilities that are found. And it's also going to be, we're looking at increasing the capabilities of the agent being installed on, hardened servers where we can't get credentials or we can't get, a mid server to communicate through a firewall. And they're going to be introducing end user experience monitoring for tops and desktops as well. And next slide, please. So just to give an overview of how the agent client collector gathers data and sends it back to ServiceNow. The agents get installed on Windows and Linux targets. You can't install them on routers and switches, obviously, so it has to be a place where you can actually install the agent. But once the agent is then installed, it sends the data that is collected back to the mid server. And in terms of collecting the data, it's essentially running scripts on those target machines. It runs all the scripts, does the data collection, and then sends the payload back to the mid server, where the mid server has a web server set up to listen to the data the agents will be sending. And then once the mid server has the data, it can then send it out to the ServiceNow instance, where it can be ingested into the CMDB to, store the discovered data. And it can also be utilized through the metrics and events capabilities that ServiceNow has. It'll send events to event management, can then turn into alerts, which can turn into incidents, and also assist with, remediating and predicting performance issues. And the little down arrow under the ServiceNow is for sending policies back to the agents, which essentially define, what are you going to be monitoring and like what are our thresholds for that monitoring. And so the policies contain what's called a check. And a check is the individual command that's run on the agent. So like I said earlier, these checks are essentially scripts. They're Ruby scripts, which you can see on the screenshot here under the command column. All of these end with .rb. So these are Ruby scripts that are executing on the target where the agent lives. And essentially the script runs, it gathers the data. So for example, we've got here OS, Linux check systems memory, check system swap, check threads count. These are each of the individual checks, and they're each basically assigned to monitor aspect of the health of the system. And each one of them runs their own Ruby script. And then so the policies it's a combination of the configuration item that the policy should be monitoring. So you can see in the image here, it's got a monitored CI type for each policy. So the Linux OS events policy is assigned to a Linux server. Same with Linux OS metrics. We set the policies up so that they are assigned to CI types in the CMDB. And the way the policies work is when you set up the check from the last slide, which is the individual commands, the policy deploys an instance of the checks. So then once the check has been deployed, you can then modify an instance of it, and that won't modify the base system policy that came with ServiceNow. So now I'm just going to go into a demo. Okay, you guys should be able to see my screen. Let me know if you can't. What we're looking at right here is my agent client collectors that are connected to my ServiceNow instance. So there is an application that you get to install called Agent Client Collector. And then, that'll give you this menu within ServiceNow. And to get to this screen, you just go to Agents from the Agent Client Collector menu. And this is showing me, my agents that are connected to ServiceNow and are up, and they are collecting data right now. So let's take a look at what we can do with these agents. So this is an agent that's just installed on a computer in my house for a Windows laptop. But this is giving me essentially any alerts that might be coming from the agent not being able to connect to ServiceNow. So that's what all of these were. Like every time the agent disconnects from ServiceNow, a self-monitoring alert will get raised until the agent connection is restored. And the other thing we've got here are the checks that are deployed against the agent. So today I'm just going to be talking about the discovery side, which is the agent client collector for visibility. Just because this is a PDI, I'm not able to use the health monitoring aspects, but we can still take a look at how you would configure the health monitoring. But essentially, this is the check that is deployed to this agent and is called Enhanced Discovery, and it's responsible for gathering the OS level information and sending it back to ServiceNow as a configuration item. And you can also, from here, you can run an ad hoc discovery on the agent. So that would trigger an immediate collection of the data on the agent, and that would get sent back to ServiceNow. You can also restart, pause data collection. You can look at the agent's config file, which is an acc.yaml, and grab the agent log. This would just help you with, troubleshooting issues with the agent. So now I just want to take a look at, so what data do you actually get with discovery from the ACC? So this is going to answer the question that was asked earlier of what are the differences between agentless and agent-based discovery, and what are the limitations. So for agentless discovery, a Windows computer, we would get all the same type of information, serial, model ID, operating system, OS version, the like OS level information. This is the same thing we would get from horizontal discovery. Same thing with the related list down here, the running processes that are running on the system, file systems, storage devices, software installed, TCP connections. We would get all of this through agentless discovery as well. So the difference is here with these related items. So with the agentless discovery, if, say, for example, if there was an IIS web server installed on this computer, I would see a related item over here for IIS. Now, with just the discovery side of the agent, which is ACCV or Agent Client Collector for Visibility, I will not get that. I will not get those relationships. So I'll show you in the dependency view what I would expect to get. So here's the computer, network adapter, disk drive, disk partition, file systems. This is the typical stuff that you would get through agentless discovery. But, with the ACCV, you're not going to get, the application dependencies like, an IIS web server, an Apache server, MS SQL database. Now, if you have the monitoring side, you will get that. And so that's a separate product. There's ITOM visibility and then there's ITOM health. So if the customer had both, then they would be able to utilize the ITOM health side as well. And they would be able to deploy, all these policies that are meant for monitoring, Tomcat events, Tomcat metrics, Oracle DB events, Oracle DB metrics. These are only for the ITOM health. If the customer doesn't have ITOM health, they won't be able to use these policies. They won't get any of this stuff discovered. They're just going to get the base OS discovery. If they do have this side, then they will get these types of CIs discovered as well, like IIS, Apache, Tomcat, etc. But the real limitation with the agent is the agent currently cannot run discovery patterns. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So this is the process classification for Tomcat. So essentially what process classifications do for discovery is when discovery is running on a remote target and it finds a Tomcat application, like a Tomcat exe running, it will then say, okay, I know what that process is and I know what to do when I see that process. I'm going to launch the Tomcat pattern. So only the agentless discovery can do this at this time. The agent cannot launch the Tomcat pattern, therefore cannot discover the Tomcat CI. And that goes back to, what we were seeing on this Windows Server record. You're really just getting the OS level discovery. This can still get you over a lot of hurdles in a discovery implementation. If you're having a client that is refusing to give credentials or, refusing to open firewall rules or ACLs, then you can offer the client collector. And I think in a lot of cases, the customer is going to be interested in that. So just to also show how this data comes into ServiceNow. So this is just the configuration items table. So just CMDB_CI. So this is everything that I was able to discover through the agent client collector. And the discovery source is ACC visibility. So with the agentless discovery, this would say like ServiceNow discovery, but there needs to be a distinction between ServiceNow discovery and the agentless discovery. And that's for being able to handle a multi-source CMDB essentially. But this is how you can determine, okay, what's coming into the CMDB through the agent-based discovery. You'll see a discovery source with ACC visibility. And here's all the CI types that are getting discovered. So that's the computer record, the disk, the file system, same things we were looking at in the dependency view there. Also every piece of software, et cetera. So currently between two computers, I got almost 1900 CIs from the, and I also want to just show, so that was the Windows-based agent, and I've also got one set up on a Linux server. Just want to show what gets discovered there. So same thing, we're getting the OS level information, serial number, host name, OS version, operating system, etc. And same type of thing down here. We're getting the software installed, the running processes, and TCP connections. So TCP connections are important because this is how ServiceNow relates the actual processes between each other. If I look at the running processes, let's filter out the empties. But basically, there's the data will be collected here for each running process. Okay, that's a bit better. So this is showing me, the SSHD process is connecting to port 54347, and there will be a corresponding process on the CI that this server is connected to that will say listening on 54347. So then ServiceNow is able to use that to determine dependency relationships between the CIs. So, and just kind of a side note on this, when I first installed the agent, I wasn't getting any TCP connections on Ubuntu. I ended up finding out that there's a problem with one of the Ruby scripts with how it was parsing the command output. And I essentially was able to modify that Ruby script to exclude some of the garbage data, which is kind of like what you can see here. There was some weird data coming back from the script, so I had to modify it. That process essentially taught me how this all worked. They're just Ruby scripts that execute on the host for Linux and Windows, and then gather the data, format it, and send it back to ServiceNow. And just the last thing to show, just on the monitoring side. So these are the policy that would get deployed when you're actually trying to do the monitoring. And if we just take a look at what's actually in the policies. So essentially, this policy is running all these checks for any Linux server where the policy is deployed. So it's checking, CPU load, disk usage, and down here, we can see the actual check instances, the commands they're running, and the thresholds for what will send alerts back to ServiceNow, or events rather. But yeah, that's everything I had to show. We're almost at time, but if anybody has any questions after this, definitely feel free to reach out to me. But are there any questions right now? Okay, I'll take that as a good sign that I explained everything perfectly. And thank you everybody for showing up.
Yeah, great job, Colin. Thanks, everyone.